You are good to go.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in to this American Compass event. I'm Wells King, the research director of American Compass, and I am delighted to be joined today by Alec MacGillis, a reporter at ProPublica and author of the new book, Fulfillment: Winning and Losing in One-Click America. Alec, welcome, and congratulations on the book.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. It's really good to be here. Um, so,
It's well, it's great to have you, and it's a really impressive book. You cover just a tremendous amount of ground, both figuratively and literally. In fulfillment, you cover several cities and regions, several decades, at different levels and altitudes too, from macro trends to
mhm.
individual narratives. It really is an impressive portrait of American life. But fulfillment is also a book about Amazon and about the America that enabled Amazon to grow into a colossus to transform the American economy and society. As you write at one point, over time in its astonishing proliferation, Amazon had segmented the country into different sorts of places, each with their assigned rank, income, and purpose. It had not only altered the national landscape itself, but also the landscape of opportunity in America, the options that lay before people, what they could aspire to do with their lives. So, Alec, what is One Click America, and why is Amazon so critical to understanding it?
uh, this book really actually started out not about Amazon, but about these enormous disparities that I was seeing around the country when I would go around as a reporter. Probably even goes back to my growing up in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, former GE town in Western Mass, that just has fallen a long way from its sort of peak in the mid 20th century. It's now lagging so badly behind Boston, Metro Boston. I saw that as I was growing up and was very bothered by it. And then again, as I traveled around the country as a reporter for the Washington Post and others in the Great Recession years, the early Obama years, seeing these incredible divides between sort of Midwestern cities and then coming back to Washington, D.C. and seeing this incredible prosperity and complacency and disconnect with what was happening out in the rest of the country. And I wanted to capture that in a book, especially after Trump's election. And I decided to focus or to frame the book through Amazon because for two reasons that I sort of settled on that One Click America as a frame for what was happening. One was just that Amazon is now so extraordinarily ubiquitous in our country that it's just a handy thread to take you around the country because it is everywhere and it's everywhere in different ways, and it just sort of is a very kind of good metaphor for sort of what we're becoming as a country because it is so omnipresent. But it's also a good frame for talking about these disparities because it is itself contributing to them. The tech giants have, through their concentration of so much of our economy, in a handful of companies, are concentrating, helping concentrate wealth and prosperity in certain places. And so that's sort of how I got from regional inequality, regional disparities to Amazon as the frame for telling that story.
Yeah, you spend a lot of time in the book in two particular winner-take-all cities, the two Washingtons, Seattle and
Right.
DC, or as Amazon would call them, HQ1 and HQ2. Both have been transformed by the company, but in different ways. Could you just describe a little bit the ways that they really sort of made Seattle and Washington what they are today and the power and influence they've used?
Sure. Actually, I picked Washington, D.C. as the second winner take all city in the book to feature before Amazon chose it for HQ2. So that was serendipitous, I guess.
Yes.
Seattle, it's just astonishing what's happened to that city. A city that was very much kind of a middle class kind of town. It started out, of course, as really kind of a more like a natural resource outpost. The place that you kind of brought the timber down from points north and east to ship out to San Francisco. And you could when I first came to Seattle in like 2004 or so, I was just so struck that it just still felt like a natural resource outpost with big rail yards and the harbor and all that. Now it's just completely transformed principally by Amazon, which now has 45,000 people working there in the headquarters, even more now, I think. And it's just been turned into this hyper prosperous kind of city where You have some of the highest housing costs, highest housing cost increases in the country, really second only to San Francisco. Very few children. It's the second highest rate of, the second lowest rate of children of any city in the country after San Francisco. Huge homelessness problem. Um, the what I focus on partly in the book is the complete displacement of Seattle's historically Black neighborhood, the Central District, this once very vital Black community that produced all these great musicians, um, and just really just a complete change of the character of the city, and then in Washington, D.C., you have a city that has, over the last couple of decades, even before Amazon arrived, has became the essentially the wealthiest city in the country. If you're looking at the full metro area, 5 or 6 of the 10 wealthiest counties in the country, um, and, and principally through the growth of, first the lobbying industry, huge growth in the influence industry, and then the growth of the whole homeland security complex after 9/11. and and now in the crucial, winner take all moment, rich get richer moment, is Amazon's deciding to put its second headquarters there, despite the fact that the city's so crowded and expensive already. They decide that they want to be there. Their public reason for that, of course, is that there's just a very skilled workforce. You have all these tech guys already there, tech guys and women, who are there already because of that sort of IT contractor universe. So they want to be there to kind of be able to get some of that talent for their second headquarters. But the other reason, of course, for them wanting to be there is that it's the seat of the federal government. And right now, the largest threat to Amazon is not so much other companies, but it's the threat of federal intervention, some attempt to rein them in. And so it's useful for them to build up their presence there in town. And they've been doing that, of course, well before HQ2. Bezos bought the Washington Post, bought the biggest mansion in town, renovated it, total price tag of $35 million to turn it into sort of a salon. Greatly increased their lobbying spending to the point where they're pretty much the biggest lobbying spenders. Tons of federal contracts that they're getting for their cloud side, and now 25,000 jobs, and a massive investment over in Arlington. So the presence of Amazon in DC is just extraordinary right now.
Well, the influence in government, I'm glad you pointed that out. I mean, you described that Amazon's vision is really commerce at its freest and most frictionless.
Right.
And talk about when Bezos has sort of professed his belief in free markets and entrepreneurship. But you spend, I think, a lot of time really trying to focus in on the ways that Amazon hasn't just disrupted old models and been a tech company, but to the extent to which it's actually used influence in government to accelerate its growth and to really become the behemoth that it is. Sort of, you talk about the Swiss Army knife approach to this.
Yes.
What exactly is Amazon's relationship to government, and to what extent is it actually really an embodiment of free and frictionless markets, or is it more a product of government subsidy?
Well, yeah, the Swiss Army knife was a metaphor I used for their just all the different forms of essentially tax avoidance that the company has, prospered from and benefited from, going all the way back, to its founding, when its initial competitive advantage had a lot to do with the fact that it did not have to assess sales taxes on sales like brick and mortar bookstores had to. And its initial decision to put the company in Seattle had a lot to do with that exact point, that if you the general rule was, if you had physical presence in a state, you had to assess sales taxes in that place. So they didn't want to be in California, where all most of the other tech companies were, because then they would have had to assess sales taxes on the biggest market in the country. So instead, they go to a smaller state like Washington State, where that's not as much of an issue. And then all for the years following, they kept, even as they were growing, and even as it would have been helpful to have warehouses in big states where most of their customers were, they often avoided putting warehouses into big states, because that would again have meant they would have had to assess sales taxes there. So that goes on for years. They didn't get to Ohio, for instance, one of the biggest states in the country, until not long ago, because with warehouses, because they didn't want to have to assess taxes there. So you have that whole sort of tax avoidance game, and then of course you have at the top level, federal income taxes, they've been incredibly successful in avoiding paying taxes there through claiming very large losses, through the sort of the Luxembourg game. Just a couple of years ago, they paid zero federal income taxes at all. Last couple of years, it's been more like $1 billion a year, which is nothing as a percentage of their what they're bringing in. But then the key thing that I spent a lot of time in the book talking about, the other part of the Swiss Army knife, is this aggressive pursuit of subsidies from local governments. When you're coming in offering to build a warehouse or data center, just this incredibly aggressive pursuit of those subsidies, along with demands of secrecy. And I got a lot of emails back and forth showing all that that kind of pressure, those demands, and it really is, if you think about it, just kind of a twofold undermining of kind of local of government, and in the sense that you're both denying the revenues needed for basic services that you're going to be demanding as your trucks are going on the roads, and as your workers are falling ill in the warehouses. And so you're reducing the revenues, and then you're also reducing any kind of accountability and transparency through your demand of total secrecy from local officials.
Yeah, it really is a striking pattern and strategy for economic development. And I like the way you juxtapose it with the past, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your treatment, for example, of Dayton, Ohio, and how it evolved from really an innovation hub in sort of the Silicon Valley of its own
Definitely.
day, into this post-industrial logistics hub that produces cardboard and sends it elsewhere.
Right.
Is this winner take all pattern of development? Is this really a novelty? And how does it differ from past patterns of development and corporate behavior that you note?
It's what we can say is that, first of all, that we've always, of course, had wealthy parts of the country and less wealthy, poorer parts of the country, of course, but those gaps have just gotten a lot bigger in recent decades, similar to the way that the gaps have grown so starkly on our income ladder between individuals. It's happened in places too. I mean, some of the most, there are two striking ways of like thinking about this. One is that as recently as well, in the mid 1960s, the wealthiest 25 cities in the country by median income included all sorts of cities in the Midwest, including Cleveland, Milwaukee, Des Moines, and my favorite is Rockford, Illinois, which now, when you go to Rockford, Illinois, and it just breaks your heart, and you think that this city was once top 25. Now only a small handful of the top 25 cities are not on the coast. But then another way of looking at it, even starker, is that in 1980, only small parts of the country had median income that were 20% above the norm, above the average, or above that. And only the Deep South and Appalachia basically had median incomes that were 20% below the average or below that. Now, huge swaths of the country are above or below those extremes. The entire Midwest, most of the Great Plains, are 20% below or lower. And so there has been, just this concentration of wealth in regional terms has grown much more dramatic. What is not unprecedented, of course, in our country is the concentration of wealth of the economy in certain companies. We are in a sense kind of returning to a Gilded Age moment, 1910, 1915, pick your date, in terms of that level of concentration. We're back to our own Standard Oil in a sense, and the question is whether we're going to respond as we did back then.
Right. And certain structures and certain ethics too, like a sort of a sense of corporate responsibility, guided some actors in the past. But Amazon, is somewhat different, and at least in terms of the way it thinks about its responsibility to its workers and the communities in which it operates. How is Amazon so different, and how does it consistently get away with the types of activities that it does, even at the most local level?
Yeah. No, it's such a good point about that contrast. I mean, in Dayton, for instance, I talk about the way that the industrialists of that made that city, what it was, just took such incredible responsibility for the city as a whole. After the Dayton suffered a terrible flood, just a really, really horrific flood of the Great Miami River, um, and and just it was essentially the recovery effort was really, led principally by the local sort of corporate fathers, and so it's such a stark contrast with Amazon and say Seattle, where the whole chapter of the book focuses on Amazon's very aggressive and successful fight to repeal a local tax that had been passed
Right.
to address the city's terrible homelessness and housing
Right.
crisis. And what was so striking about that was that the company had actually agreed to a compromise tax amount, a lower amount that they kind of negotiated the mayor down to, the council down to, and they got it done. They signed it, and then just 2 days later, the company launches heavily funds a referendum repeal effort, and is successful, just by completely outmatches the opposition with their spending to get that law repealed, that tax repealed. So just a much different conception of sort of what citizenship, corporate citizenship
Right.
means.
Right. And also the action of citizens themselves. You, I think, make some really interesting points about the ways that it's actually shaped political incentives
Mhm.
at the local and national level. Could you talk a little bit about the ways that sort of it's shaping political attitudes, the extent to which the sort of the attitudes of Amazon consumers who tend to be suburban, high net worth, in and around the metros, uh, how they now have a different set of incentives, at least when it comes to Amazon, compared to, say, the workers in the exurbs and in the warehouses.
Right. No, and this is one reason that Amazon was successful in getting that tax repealed in Seattle, that it managed to, even though Seattle is very, very liberal, 90% voted, against Trump in 2016, um, the Amazon managed to tap into really kind of a sort of an unpleasant kind of anti-government, almost Tea Party-ish, leftist Tea
Mhm.
Party-ish feeling that whatever money will be raised by this tax, the government will probably just waste it anyway. They won't really be effective in addressing homelessness,
Right.
and also a sort of conflicted feeling around Amazon, where in theory a lot of people in Seattle know that the company is not good in all sorts of ways, and is and has brought Seattle, worse traffic and all that, but but it's kind of changed the character of the city. But at the same time, also a feeling that, they've also made me more prosperous. Like my home, my little house that I bought for 200,000 is now worth $1 million. Um, you know, I'm there's a sort of pride. There was a pride in the golden goose that was Amazon, and
Right.
a reluctance to take it on. And you see that more broadly on the left as well. I mean,
Right.
this is the key thing about Amazon, is that Amazon's biggest demographic, its strongest demographic, it's universal, but its strongest demographic is the middle upper middle class, urban, mostly liberal consumer. That's why you see boxes stacked outside apartment buildings in Manhattan that doormen don't know what to do with, and and there is a deep affinity for the company, among liberal Democrats who would otherwise be sort of wary of like the
Right.
big corporation. Amazon is the most trusted entity in
Yep.
America among Democrats, according to one poll. So, and that affinity has gotten so much stronger this past year. Of course, that reliance, that deep cultural reliance on the sort of one-click life, got even stronger in Blue America than it did in Red America this past year, because Blue America had a strikingly different risk assessment about coronavirus. It was even more insistent on adopting a one-click approach to daily life.
Right. And now we're seeing, or have seen, a pretty aggressive organizing campaign in a red state,
Mhm.
in Alabama. To what extent are these sort of concerns and this push for a reinvigorated organizing labor movement at Amazon warehouses? To what extent does that show some promise? And to what extent do you think that'll potentially shape the future of sort of a public relations with Amazon, the way that we think about the winners and the losers that Amazon creates?
It's hard to say, because we don't know it so much depends actually on what's going to happen,
Yep.
and but the stakes are enormous. I just think I think of it kind of in grand historical terms, that this has become, the warehouse has become sort of the mass employment option now in our country. Like this, that they're hiring so many people. Where the warehouses are growing so fast, proliferating so fast. This is where you go if you just kind of need a job at a given moment. The way you used to go down to the mill. Those mill jobs got were uplifted through organizing. They were really low paid, really tough jobs that became sort of middle class jobs, largely through unionization. And so the question now is, will these warehouse jobs also be somehow uplifted in years to come from something that's just a $15 an hour thing that you kind of pass through when you really need a job, but you don't stay long, or that becomes something that can actually sustain some kind of a middle class family lifestyle. But as far as how it's going to affect our attitude, our view of them, I mean, the fact is that even now, even short of unionization, even when we in theory know that these jobs are really tough and are not being paid enough and are really grueling and rudimentary and isolating, we as consumers have, that has not kept us from
Right.
so
It's certainly not during the COVID period where we've seen just a surge in online shopping. So what do you see as being the sort of future of One Click America as we move on from the COVID-19 pandemic, as we're awaiting the results of the union vote in Alabama, potentially at the Amazon warehouse there? What do you see as being the sort of future of One Click America, the public's attitudes and critiques and distrust of Amazon potentially, and the way that we think about trying to bridge these regional divides that Amazon and largely the sort of one-click economy have created?
in addition to the organizing, I see really two main strands right now. One is the antitrust fight in Washington. So much is going to depend on what how much reform happens there, and that's going to be fascinating because it's largely an intra-democratic fight between the sort of general affinity for big tech among Democrats, the revolving door from the Obama administration to the Silicon Valley, and then specific voices now on the left like Lena Khan and Warren, and who are trying to do something about this, and whether the Biden administration is willing to kind of break from the Obama laxness toward big tech will be very interesting to watch. But then and the other strand is the American citizen and consumer, and whether we are going to be willing to not go cold turkey, not like somehow just, but in some way re-engage with the physical world around us after this year, and not just in our shopping, but just in all sorts of ways. Going back to the theater after having gotten addicted to Netflix, and somehow getting back into the communities around us, the physical world around us, because if we don't, then they're going to continue to wither. And that's, I mean, the book is really meant partly to sort of as a kind of a goad to all of us to some degree just re-engage in our physical space, our physical place that we live, our towns and our cities, because they need us.
Yes. You spent a lot of time doing interviews and documenting the stories and biographies of Amazon workers and people who have interacted with the one-click America economy on the ground. Do you get a sense from your experience with them that that things will turn around? Do you see some glimmers of hope? The book does end on a pretty pessimistic note. So where do you see sort of the glimmers of hope beyond Washington and individual consumer behavior?
I gotta say, I mean, I have been discouraged this past year by the alacrity with which we all sort of embraced this, how eager we seem to be to take the permission that we had sort of from the authorities to kind of just to close in. And I really do hope that it passes. I did see some, I find there are people in the book who definitely do give me hope. I mean, there, and I think give readers hope too, that there are small business owners who are still trying to sort of find their way, fight off the Goliath. There are this young man in Southeast Ohio who's, came back home from Washington to try to help, sort of rebuild his very struggling Appalachian town in Southeast Ohio. He's still at it out there. He's an amazing young man. He's in the book. He gives me hope. I do think I still think that there's something in all of us that knows that this is not really a good way for us to exist with each other, and I do hope that we can sort of find our way forward from this moment, and just get back to some kind of a more uh, a more human kind of way of living and living our daily life.
Well, it certainly is an eye-opening book in that regard, I think, in really exposing, I think, the underlying facts and features of American life today, ones that we don't immediately notice, be it here in Washington or elsewhere. So thank you for writing it with that. We are out of time, but thank you so much for joining me, Alec. And again, congratulations on the book. Again, the book is Fulfillment, Winning and Losing in One Click America.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.